All right, let's set up the ability for our users to edit their questions. We've got this page, this question page. It would be a good start to just add a little button over here that says edit. And of course, we don't want just anyone to be able to edit a question. We only want the user who created the question to be able to edit the question. So we'll set this to be not visible on page load by default and define a condition here that says when the current user is the current page questions creator, then this element is visible. And it's always a good idea when you're doing these kind of conditional visibility, either make everything not visible on page load and have the condition to show it in the conditionals, or set it always to be visible and then have the condition to hide it in the conditional tab, but don't have a mixture of the two. You'll find that it'll be very confusing to keep up with why elements are behaving or not, and you'll be jumping between these tabs to figure out what the behavior should be. So just stick with one way, and I recommend you do that they are invisible on page load, because sometimes Bubble will render the element that you might want to hide first, and then the bit of programming that tells that element to hide is actually only going to be rendered by the page later on. And so what happens is that the image might appear for a split second and then disappear once that condition kicks in. So it's always better to hide it by default and then show it. Moving on. So let's figure out what we're going to do with this start edit workflow. Now, the first way that probably most people would think is that, okay, well, here we're going to create probably another pop-up or something, right? We'll create another pop-up and we'll have some inputs in that pop-up and that when saved allow us to edit this question. But a much better way, if your app design allows it, is to actually double up the form that you already created for creating a question and use it for editing a question as well. And we already have that form, of course. We have the ask page over here. So what we could do is navigate to that ask page. And we have to make some changes now on the ask page so that it knows that to expect a question. Because at the moment, this page doesn't have any type of content. It's purely for creating a question. But if we want to double up this page to be used for editing questions as well, then we have to add some conditional behavior here. First of all, is that we need a trigger, right? We need some reference that this page can look to and say, if this condition is true, then, set up these inputs, set up the button, even set up the text, ask a question to say, edit this question, set up all of that conditional behavior to reflect whether or not we're editing or creating. So that reference point, that trigger, should really be whether or not this page contains a question, right? Whether the page as a container for data actually has data in it. Because then we can say, if it doesn't have data in it, what we're doing is creating a question. If it does have data in it, then what we're doing is editing that question. So what we can do is set this ask page to be of type question. And now you'll see that we got a little issue tracker pop up, and one of those is because when we click this edit button, we're now not sending any data. We need to configure this. So data to send will be the current page's question. Now when we go onto this ask page, we can then reference whether or not this page has a question. So for example, this ask a question text, okay? We could say in the conditional tab that when the current page's question is not empty, then this text will read, edit this question. Okay, let's try this out. So I'm actually already open on a populated question page here. I am still the same user who was logged in. Like if I log out, now that button will disappear, so it should. So I'll just quickly log back in again. Now that edit button is appearing. So let's click it, and then we are taken to the Ask page with our questions slug, and this text is being reflected. Now, one way to configure this behavior, for a text to say one thing when a condition is true and another when the condition is false, is actually not to use this conditional behavior at all. We can actually do everything within this one text input. So what we can do is we can go, when the current page question is empty, if we click here again, we have this option formatted as text. And that allows us to enter in something for when the condition is true and something for when the condition is false. And this can often be a lot cleaner way of creating this conditional behavior when it comes to text behavior. So, when it is empty, we want to say ask a question. And when it's not empty, we want to say edit a question. And now you see that the behavior is happening the same way. So we can obviously do some more conditional behavior down here in the inputs. At the moment, we've got no initial content, but that's going to change if this page contains a question. So we'll go current page's question title. And that'll allow us, obviously, if we're editing a question, then we want to see what information is already saved about that question. So here you go, there it is. Same thing for the question body. And same thing for the question tags. And the last thing, of course, is to actually configure this button. So we'll set up a similar condition here. And now we have to set up another workflow. At the moment, we've just got a create workflow. So this exactly the same logic as before. We only want this workflow to fire when the current page question is empty. All right. And if I just copy this, right, I can delete this, and say this is when it's not empty, right? So this is our workflow for when we're editing a question, and this is our workflow for when we're creating a question. So when we're editing, that last step can still be to go to the page question, but first we will, of course, have a make changes to thing action. The thing we're making changes to is the current page's question. And then we just link up all of these inputs again. We should actually still have a set of things slug, because if the title changes, then we might also want to change the slug. One thing to note here though is that for SEO purposes, you might want one page to have the same slug in perpetuity so that Google has time to build up a history of that page. If you're changing the slug, then Google will then see that as an entirely new page, and you have to build up that SEO history. Again, that's for those of you who are into SEO. So in our case, we're going to just update it. We don't really care. We're going to change the question and update the slug to be the inputs value as well. And then this, of course, is going to be the result of step 1. So now we've got Remy Brescent here, and run away from the bar. We're rewriting cinema history here. And we'll save those changes. And now we're back on the question page. Our slug is new, and of course our body is new. Now we could do the same thing, of course, for these answers. If you were logged in as someone who wrote one of these answers, then we could have a little sort of edit icon here, a little pencil icon. Click it, up opens the pop-up, and you could then edit the pre-populated information. Now, I won't show you how to do that, but it is exactly the same concept as what we just did for the question. All right, in the next video, we're going to be tackling option sets, and we're going to use that to build out our tag functionality a little bit.